Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. Thank you all again for your patience waiting for this episode. I'm finding that the closer we get in this narrative to the final collapse of the USSR, the more complicated it is to first understand myself and then to communicate to you what's going on in this story. I'm doing my best to stick to the timeline of releasing a new episode every other week, but as my subject matter gets increasingly complex, so too does my personal life, with a busy work schedule and my son now reaching his terrible twos. It's just not always possible for me to get that done. I appreciate everyone's patience and understanding on that front. For those who are new, what you're about to hear is part 43 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. I produce these episodes with the goal of making them as accessible and digestible as possible on their own, so you can listen to them and get something out of them even if you haven't listened to all the previous episodes. That said, if you start to feel lost or you just want to understand the story in its full context, that context can usually be found in the earlier episodes. Last time, I gave a brief overview of the history of the Baltic republics, their people, how and why they came to be part of the USSR, and a little bit about the experience of the Baltic peoples during the Soviet period. Today I will cover the independence movements that arose in these republics in the late 1980s and early 1990s, setting the example for national independence movements that soon erupted all over the USSR, leading ultimately to its final demise. This is The End of History, Part 43. How do we determine whether the actions of a democratically elected government are legitimate? Those who are regular listeners know that in my day job I'm a lawyer, so I could give you a very technical answer to that question if I wanted, but that's not really what I'm asking. From a philosophical standpoint, when is it okay for elected leaders to take a radical action that departs significantly from the status quo? I live in the United States, as does over 60% of my audience, and we're in the midst of a debate over this very issue right now, with the present administration taking a lot of policy steps that I would define as incredibly radical, and claiming that they won the election last year and therefore have a mandate to take these radical actions. Now, this is not a political podcast, and my goal here is not to talk about the specifics of the Trump administration's policy objectives. But I find the political use of the word mandate interesting here. The term is not really defined, but it seems to suggest that such an overwhelming majority of the population supports their agenda that they have no choice but to implement it. But when you examine the numbers, that's not really true. In terms of voter turnout, the 2024 election was actually a pretty good year for the United States, with roughly 65% of eligible voters casting a vote. Of those, just under 50% voted for the winning candidate. I'm not disputing that he won. He got more votes than any other candidates. Period. End of story. But does a government elected by less than a third of eligible voters really have a mandate to upend the administrative system that has governed a country for decades? Is it legitimate for a government, once elected in such a way, to do things that are not broadly popular with the public, including many of the people who elected them? I have an opinion on this, but not a definite answer. It's a question as old as democracy itself. What are the limits of democratic legitimacy? If the people vote democratically to end democracy, would that be a legitimate democratic act? As I did the research for today's episode, I kept thinking of these questions because, like most people, I am inclined to view history through the lens of my present, and to view my present through the lens of history. In March 1990, Lithuania became the first republic of the USSR to declare independence. The government that declared this independence was elected in March 1990 in an election with 71% turnout, and the ruling movement, Sąjūdis, which refused to define itself as a political party, received less than half of the total votes. This is not to say that independence from the Soviet Union was unpopular at that time. It was overwhelmingly popular. even among members of the Communist Party. But there was widespread disagreement on what independence meant and how it would be achieved. Polling from the time indicates that most people expected independence would be a gradual process rather than an abrupt declaration of de facto independence. And yet, the government saw themselves as elected to advance independence, and that's what they did. What, I hear you asking? When did Soviet Lithuania become a democracy? Isn't the Soviet Union an authoritarian state governed by the centralized party bureaucracy in Moscow? Well, something I haven't covered on this podcast yet, and will cover in more detail when I get back to the events in Moscow in an upcoming episode, is the 1988 amendment to the Soviet Constitution, spearheaded by Gorbachev and his reform faction of the party. At the 19th Communist Party Congress in 1988, frustrated with the old-school hardliners placing roadblocks to his efforts to liberalize the state, instead of continuing to push reform within the party, Mikhail Gorbachev took the unprecedented step of trying to separate the state from the Communist Party. Those of you who have been with me since the very beginning will recall that way back in the first episode of this series, I described the Soviet political system, wherein the official elected government was dominated and acted in concert with a sort of parallel state run by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Theoretically, all state power flowed from the Soviet Union's supreme legislative body, the Supreme Soviet. Though the Supreme Soviet was not technically an arm of the Communist Party, the party determined eligibility for election to the Supreme Soviet, and selected candidates, selected by the party, ran unopposed in a yes or no vote. The vast majority of those elected to the Supreme Soviet were members of the Communist Party, and the few independents elected were still approved and selected by the Communist Party, so their inclusion was wholly for the sake of appearance. At the 19th Party Congress in July 1988, Gorbachev had filled the ranks of the party with enough pro-perestroika members that he had enough votes to upend this system. The Constitution was amended to replace the old Supreme Soviet with a new Congress of People's Deputies. The electoral rules in this system were rather complex, and I won't dive deeply into them here, but in short, though the system was skewed heavily to favor the election of communists, for the first time, seats in this parliament could be contested. It was possible for non-communists to be elected and to have a real voice in government. In March 1989, the first free and fair election in the history of the USSR was held. In Russia and some of the other republics closer to the center of power, the communists managed to secure victory, though many non-communists were elected, notably Boris Yeltsin, who had by this time left the party, was elected as a deputy from Moscow. The republics on the periphery of the Union, most notably the Baltics, tended to skew much more anti-communist. The issue of independence was the paramount issue in the campaign, and it even led to a split in the Lithuanian Communist Party, with the majority of Lithuanian communists breaking from the pro-Moscow leadership and campaigning on a moderate pro-independence platform. In February 1990, similar elections were held at the republic level, and all three Baltic republics overwhelmingly elected pro-independence deputies to their republic-level parliaments. In Estonia and Latvia, the new parliaments quickly passed declarations of sovereignty within the USSR, essentially maintaining membership in the USSR in a confederated status, but declaring that Estonian and Latvian laws would take precedence over the laws of the Soviet Union. In Lithuania, the new parliament went further, electing Vytautas Landsbergis, a conservatory professor and founding member of the Sąjūdis independence movement, as the body's chairman, the chief executive or president of the republic. Landsbergis subsequently led the charge for a full and unequivocal declaration of independence from the USSR. On March 11th, the measure passed. It read, in part, quote, "The Supreme Council of the Republic of Lithuania, expressing the will of the nation, decrees and solemnly proclaims that the execution of the sovereign powers of the state of Lithuania, abolished by foreign forces in 1940, is re-established, and henceforth Lithuania is again an independent state." End quote. Where did this declaration come from? And why on earth did Mikhail Gorbachev think that liberalizing the USSR to the degree that such a declaration was possible was a good idea? Couldn't he see that this level of openness would inevitably lead to consequences like this? Well, the short answer is no, he didn't. I've talked about this before, but Mikhail Gorbachev, though highly intelligent and possessing acute political instincts, was a bit of a starry-eyed idealist, and he was also supremely self-confident. He firmly believed that people had the absolute right to exercise their voices through democracy. But he also seems to have genuinely believed that if he gave people the freedom to choose their future, they would choose socialism, and that he could persuade a majority of his vision for the future. On this topic, Gorbachev himself wrote in his memoirs, quote, "I must confess that while admitting the possibility of secession in principle, I had hoped that the development of economic and political reform would outpace the secession process. Having experienced the real benefits of a federation, people would no longer be obsessed by the idea of full independence, and the problem would be resolved to everybody's advantage." End quote. In other words, he understood that there were strong movements for independence, but he misunderstood part of what was driving these movements. He believed that if he lifted the burden of the authoritarian state, improved the economy, and granted limited autonomy within the Union, that the main impetus for independence would evaporate. He believed that the benefits of the Baltic States and other Soviet republics remaining in economic union and political confederation with Russia were self-evident. He believed he was building something truly great, a USSR that held to its ideals of equality without the baggage of the authoritarian state or one-party rule. He could not understand why anybody would not want to be a part of that. In this, he was rather short-sighted. The fact is, I think most people in the Baltic states recognized that the USSR Gorbachev was trying to build would be, if not ideal, at least better than what came before, and many of them even applauded it. But most had no interest in being part of it anymore. The damage had already been done. In 1993, the Baltic German-descended British historian Anatol Levin wrote, quote, "The Baltic experience demonstrates the central dilemma of Gorbachev's entire effort, a dilemma he appears still not to understand. Glasnost was inevitably going to bring a new honesty about the past, but since the entire communist claim to legitimacy and to positive achievements was based on lies, this honesty would sooner or later bring down the whole system." End quote. This would eventually ring true across the entire USSR, especially with regard to the legacy of Lenin and the revolution, there being an open public debate as to whether Lenin and the Bolsheviks were truly democratic-minded idealists whose legacy was betrayed by Stalin, as Gorbachev and his ilk saw them, or whether they were authoritarians all along, and Stalin's terror advanced rather than violated their legacy. The historical record, in my opinion, contains much more support for the latter conclusion, and the open discussion of this led to a loss of faith in the underpinning of Soviet legitimacy. In the Baltic, however, the open discussion and debate was over the legacy of the 1940 annexation to the Soviet Union. The official line had always been that the Baltic states experienced a genuine socialist revolution, which prompted them to, without any coercion from Moscow, voluntarily join the USSR. This line is, of course, absurd, and nobody but perhaps the most poorly educated Baltic Russians ever actually believed it. But prior to Glasnost, no other point of view could be expressed publicly. Thus, though most people knew better, they also knew better than to talk about it. The decades-long campaign of mass gaslighting also likely led some historically literate people in the Baltic to question what they even knew, and even to accept the official narrative to some degree. But the open discussion of this history by Baltic academics helped lead to a massive backlash against Soviet rule in the Baltic states. Opposition to Soviet rule in the Baltic had a similar origin to dissident movements in other parts of the Soviet Union, the origins of which I covered back in episode 23. Samizdat, or self-published journals, newspapers, poems, and novels were passed around, leading to the formation of underground groups where subversive individuals would come together to read and discuss prohibited ideas. Later, as elsewhere in the USSR, so called Helsinki groups formed for the purpose of monitoring Soviet compliance with the standards of the Helsinki Agreement and the rights supposedly guaranteed in the Soviet Constitution. The prohibition of government or party critical speech meant that these groups rarely protested publicly, and while widely read and discussed in private by friends, their actual membership was almost always relatively small, and just for good measure, they were usually infiltrated and monitored by the KGB. The first public protests in the Baltic came over what, at first glance, probably seems like an unlikely issue: environmental concerns. Environmental activism had, unlike political activism, long been tolerated by Soviet authorities, especially in Russia, where there's a long standing cultural tradition of living close to the land and advocacy for preserving the integrity of that land. Like the Russian literary tradition, this could never be fully suppressed by Soviet authorities. The regime didn't like it, but it wasn't harshly punished either. When environmental protests first emerged in the Baltic States in the 1980s, they at first appeared quite similar to the type of environmental activism that was tolerated in Russia, but they would eventually turn quite a bit more subversive. Like a lot of aspects of this story, the critical turning point was the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl in 1986, which I covered back in episodes 32 and 33. The Baltic region suffered significantly from the Chernobyl fallout. It was only worse in Ukraine and Belarus. Baltic servicemen were among those sent to mitigate the fallout. Many of them died or suffered lifelong problems as a result, and the disaster created a wave of anti-nuclear energy activism, as well as anti-regime sentiment. For example, in 1987, in the wake of the disaster at Chernobyl, environmental activists successfully petitioned the government to cancel a planned expansion of the Ignalina nuclear power plant in southeast Lithuania. Movements also sprang up to curb other industries that people believed caused negative health externalities. In Estonia, for instance, a movement formed to oppose phosphate mining, and this was actually one of the primary issues that led to the foundation of the movement that would lead to independence there. But environmental demonstrations soon intertwined with nationalist and pro-independence causes. It was not uncommon to see environmental demonstrators unfurl the national flags of Latvia, Estonia, or Lithuania, which had been banned since 1940, or to be heard singing national songs associated with the era of independence. With the coming of Glasnost and open discussion of the history of annexation came increasing awareness and anger at the Soviet regime and the historical wrongs that had been perpetrated on the Baltic states. Small environmental activist groups soon expanded their wheelhouse to embrace political activism as well. By 1988, Glasnost had become a cultural norm, and people were generally a lot less fearful. More overtly political groups emerged in the Baltic, like the Estonian National Heritage Society, which was ostensibly dedicated to preserving Estonia's cultural heritage, but in practice quickly became an overtly pro-independence political movement. I have made a genuine effort to truly understand the nature and inner workings of many of these opposition groups that sprang up in the Baltic states in the late 1980s, but frankly, there are just too many and the interplay between them too complex to cover in detail without getting severely sidetracked and derailing my main narrative, something I am afraid I'm already at risk of doing. But to sum up, the various opposition movements in the Baltic states were incredibly ideologically diverse. There were communist splinter groups, democratic socialists, economic liberals, social conservatives, hardcore ethno-nationalists, and everything in between. What they all had in common was historical grievance over the occupation of their countries and a desire to reassert independence. The unprecedented openness of Glasnost meant that these groups were not only able to speak publicly, but they were able to speak to and coordinate with each other. In the lead up to the 50th anniversary of the notorious Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which led to the Soviet occupation in the first place, pro-independence groups from all three Baltic countries coordinated with one another to organize a mass human chain, connecting the three Baltic capitals of Vilnius, Lithuania, Riga, Latvia, and Tallinn, Estonia. They successfully carried out this plan on the anniversary, August 8, 1989. Meant as a symbol of unity between the three countries in defiance of the Soviet occupation, this human chain, known as the Baltic Way, stretched in a continuous line of people holding hands for over 690 kilometers. That's roughly 430 miles for my American listeners, and involved over 2 million people. The Soviet regime, even with Gorbachev at the helm, at first reverted to an older way of reacting to such acts of dissent. Though no one was arrested, the official party newspaper, Pravda, and state television lashed out at demonstrators, calling them nationalist extremists, among other things, and accused them of discriminating against people who still believed in Soviet ideals. When the Communist Party Central Committee met, the more hardline members still in the body floated the idea of using the military to violently suppress the independence movements in the Baltic. They were outvoted by Gorbachev and the reformers, who still hoped to salvage a peaceful compromise solution. After all three Baltic states elected pro-independence governments in the election of February 1990, the writing was on the wall for Soviet presence in the Baltic. It should have been clear by then that to maintain Soviet rule in the Baltic states would require some degree of force. They had no desire to remain in union with the other Soviet republics. As I mentioned briefly before, the new parliaments in Estonia and Latvia stopped short of outright declaring independence, opting instead to pass sovereignty laws, which declared their own republic laws to override all union laws in the case of conflict. Most of the deputies were outspoken about their support for full independence, but the majority embraced it as a gradual process, and they were open to negotiation with Moscow and perhaps even a continued confederated status within the USSR. This is perhaps because the Estonian and Latvian parliaments both contained a high proportion of communists compared to Lithuania. In all three countries, the republic-level communist parties had split from Moscow during the campaign over the issue of independence, but those communists elected still felt a kinship with their fellow communists in Russia, and were more likely to place the word independence in quotes, and favor some kind of continued affiliation with the USSR, even if it was a much more devolved association. Latvia and Estonia also had much larger populations of ethnic Russians, who were far more likely to oppose independence, or at least favor some kind of continued association with their mother country, though polling at the time did show that even a majority of Baltic Russians favored independence. Again, though, for many, that word was probably in quotes. Lithuania was different. One of the first things their parliament did upon convening was to declare independence. After Lithuania declared independence, Gorbachev and the other reformers in the Kremlin were significantly less conciliatory. The act was immediately declared illegal, and Gorbachev demanded that the act be immediately rescinded, telling the Lithuanians that there would be consequences if they failed to do so. The Red Army garrisons in Lithuania were reinforced and placed on alert. Gorbachev considered staging a coup in Lithuania and also seriously considered military invasion, going so far as to authorize the Red Army to formulate a plan for that invasion. Eventually, he backed off on these plans and settled on an economic blockade to force Lithuania to the negotiating table. On April 18, 1990, Gorbachev issued an ultimatum to the Lithuanian parliament to rescind the Declaration of Independence and resume their status as a constituent republic of the USSR immediately or face economic blockade. When the ultimatum was refused, a blockade began the next day. The blockade was devastating for Lithuania. Though they were among the most prosperous of the Soviet republics, they had been completely economically integrated with the USSR for 50 years, and there were a lot of things that they simply could not produce on their own without support from the Soviet government. Above all, they relied on Russia to supply most of their energy. They could not make up for the blockade by trading with foreign countries because most countries did not recognize the legitimacy of their independence, and none were bold enough to openly defy the blockade. However weakened the Soviet Union was at this point, It was still a nuclear superpower with a formidable military and a huge amount of geopolitical influence. In the United States, President Bush was trepidatious about supporting the Lithuanians. He knew that Gorbachev was on shaky ground politically. He had just allowed all of the Soviet Union's Eastern European satellite states to collapse without a shot being fired in anger. Bush understood that was one thing, already deeply unpopular among the hardliners in his own government, but to allow a constituent republic of the USSR to declare independence was quite another. Bush believed that Gorbachev was the best chance the world had for a peaceful end to the Cold War and for the Soviet Union to be integrated into a post-Cold War world. And he understood that if Gorbachev were to be perceived as weak or allowing the country to disintegrate, there was likely to be a coup against him by the hardliners. Something that actually happened just a year later. And I promise, we will be talking about that on this podcast soon. In short, Bush and other Western leaders wanted Gorbachev to succeed in his efforts to reform the USSR, fearing the unpredictable geopolitical consequences of an outright collapse, and so they refused to support Lithuanian independence, because to do so was likely to further destabilize the Soviet Union. The Lithuanians were on their own. By June 1990, the approval rating of the Lithuanian president, Landsbergis, had dropped to an abysmal 28%, and people were eager to end the blockade before winter set in. On July 2, 1990, after negotiations with the central government in Moscow, the Lithuanians agreed to suspend the Act of Independence, but not to rescind it, pending further negotiations with Moscow, provided the blockade was lifted. Gorbachev, who, as I will cover in upcoming episodes, had other fires to put out elsewhere, readily agreed to these terms. Continued negotiations were originally scheduled for October 1990, and were later pushed back to November. In November, the Soviet delegation again postponed the negotiations, citing the need to prepare for an upcoming party congress, and did not propose a new negotiation date. When the Soviets failed to propose a new date, the Lithuanians determined that the Soviets were not negotiating in good faith and opted to reinstate the Act of Independence. In January 1991, inflation in Lithuania reached 100%, and allegedly egged on by the KGB seeking to destabilize Lithuania and ripen it for intervention, Russian-speaking workers demonstrated against the increase in the price of consumer goods and against discrimination of ethnic minorities by the Lithuanian national government. On January 8th, members of a pro-union organization made up mostly of ethnic Russians, Jedinstvo, Russian for unity, attempted to storm the Lithuanian parliament. Security forces backing the nationalist government turned them back with violence, albeit non-lethal violence, turning water cannons on the crowd to force them back. Gorbachev, still on shaky ground politically at home, had no choice but to respond, else he would seem weak to the hardliners in his government, who by this time he suspected were plotting to overthrow him. He could not afford to ignore the crisis. On January 8th and 9th, 1991, Red Army reinforcements poured into Lithuania, preparing for a military solution to the crisis. Then, on January 10th, Gorbachev issued yet another public ultimatum to the Lithuanians. The Lithuanians were to immediately resume the constitution of the USSR and abandon all quote-unquote anti-constitutional laws. He warned them that military intervention was an option on the table, but he gave no further details as to what Moscow's response would be. Beginning around 11 a.m. on the morning of January 11, 1991, the Red Army moved several armored and airborne divisions into the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius, and began to secure strategic strongpoints and government buildings, including the Parliament building. They also secured and set up roadblocks on all roads heading into or out of the capital. The whole operation moved so quickly that nobody on the Lithuanian side had time to formulate a plan to oppose it. It was on the third day of the operation, January 13th, as the soldiers were moving to secure targets of secondary importance in the city, including the main TV station, when significant nonviolent resistance was first encountered. As the soldiers moved toward the TV station, they were confronted by a crowd of protesters blocking their way. What happened next remains a subject of some debate. What is clear is that the Soviet soldiers opened fire on the crowd with live ammunition and pushed through with tanks, killing 14 people and wounding hundreds. What is less clear is what prompted them to do this. These were among the USSR's most seasoned and disciplined troops, most of them veterans of the fighting in Afghanistan. It is unlikely that they got nervous and opened fire on a defenseless crowd without provocation, though that is, of course, a possibility. It's more likely that someone ordered them to fire. The commander of the Red Army's Vilnius garrison, Vladimir Ushopchik, was later prosecuted and convicted in absentia for the massacre by Lithuanian prosecutors, though he continues to proclaim innocence, stating that he never gave such an order. His extradition continues to be blocked by the government of his home country, Belarus. Gorbachev himself swore up and down that he gave orders for troops to avoid violent confrontation with the crowd, and he denied any responsibility for the massacre in Vilnius until his dying day. He was contradicted in this by KGB head Vladimir Khrushchev, who proclaimed loudly and often that Gorbachev had full knowledge of and approved of orders to use force against protesters in Vilnius. Of course, Khrushchev was one of the main architects of the August 1991 coup against Gorbachev, and subsequently spent the rest of his life campaigning to malign and discredit Gorbachev, so he's not exactly the most objective source. Though it is speculation, I think the explanation of Vadim Bakatin, the former Soviet Minister of Interior, is plausible. He stated that Gorbachev likely believed a show of force would cow the Lithuanians without the need for bloodshed, and probably didn't issue any orders on the use of deadly force either way. The truth of Gorbachev's culpability will probably never be known with certainty. The following day, on January 14th, rather than be cowed by the violence of the previous day, a crowd of thousands gathered around the Parliament building, where they constructed barricades to defend it against another attack. Gorbachev was reportedly horrified by the violence, and was not eager to repeat it. Rather than continue the operation, he ordered his commanders to back down and retreat from the immediate vicinity of Parliament, though Soviet troops continued to occupy other strategic points in Vilnius and elsewhere in the country. For the time being, a final resolution evaded Lithuania, as a sort of uneasy status quo limped on for a few months. Rival governments in Moscow and Vilnius both claimed sovereignty over the country, claiming the laws of the other to be invalid. But there was no further violence. Resolution would eventually come from the outside in August, when communist hardliners attempted a coup, forcing the USSR into its final endgame. I will cover that coup eventually, but before I do, we will first have to catch up on events back in Moscow and in the Caucasus, and that will be the subject of my next few episodes. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, a very special thank you to my patrons who support the show with monthly donations on Patreon. If you appreciate what I do and you want to support the show, you can become a patron at patreon.com/historyspherepodcast. If you can't afford to become a patron, I get it. Times are hard right now. You can also support the show by giving it a 5-star rating on your podcast platform of choice, subscribing, and by telling your friends about us. If you're listening on Spotify, you can leave a comment directly on the episode, and I encourage you to do that. Ask a question, correct a mistake, or just tell me what you thought of the episode. More engagement helps to promote the show in the algorithm and introduce it to new listeners, so all of your input is greatly appreciated. Links to the Patreon, the show's social media pages, and all my streaming platforms can be found on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. On that website, you will also find a list of my sources for this episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. Rather than leave you all hanging again, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that this time there will be no new episode for 3 weeks. My son is turning 2, and that celebration will definitely take me away from my regular research and preparation for the podcast. This podcast is my passion, and I love you all, but whenever there is a conflict between the podcast and my son, he's going to win. He's cuter than you. When I return in 3 weeks, rather than take you directly to the Caucasus as I had initially intended to do, I have decided to switch up the order of my planned episodes and take you first back to Moscow to catch you up on events there, including and especially the rise of Boris Yeltsin. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.